I'm Margaret Sullivan, 56 years old, and that moment will haunt me forever. Our annual Thanksgiving dinner, the crystal chandelier sparkling above our mahogany table in our Connecticut home. William, my firstborn, rising confidently, champagne flute in hand. The room quieted as he began his toast. Then, those words, delivered as his eyes locked with mine. Some people matter. Others just take up space. I froze. Blood drained from my face as memories flooded back. In that instant, I knew the perfect family facade I'd maintained for decades was about to shatter completely. Before I share what happened next, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community of real-life storytellers. Believe me, you'll want to hear how this shocking family betrayal unfolded and how I fought back. The irony of William's toast wasn't lost on me. For 30 years, I dedicated my life to ensuring everyone in my family mattered, especially my children. I hadn't started with much. Growing up in a small Ohio town, the daughter of a factory worker and a waitress, I'd clawed my way to success through sheer determination. I built my real estate business from nothing, starting as an assistant and working 80-hour weeks until I became one of the top brokers in Connecticut. I met Richard during my second year in business when he was a medical resident. Handsome, ambitious, and from a wealthy family, he represented everything I'd aspired to. When he proposed after just 6 months, I believed I'd finally secured my place in the world. Our wedding was small. Richard's mother, Evelyn, had made it clear she thought her son was marrying down. But I was determined to prove her wrong. I threw myself into becoming the perfect wife, learning the social graces and mannerisms that my upbringing hadn't provided. When William was born a year later, followed by Diane 2 years after, and finally James, our family portrait seemed complete. I devoted myself to creating the ideal home. Our first house was modest, purchased with money I'd inherited from my grandmother's life insurance policy. As Richard's surgical career took off and my real estate business flourished, we upgraded to increasingly prestigious addresses. Our current home, a colonial revival on 3 acres in one of Connecticut's most exclusive neighborhoods, had been featured in regional magazines. The Sullivans have it all, people would say. William followed his father's ambitious path, becoming an investment banker at a prestigious firm. Diane, our middle child, graduated top of her class from law school and joined a corporate firm in Boston. James, the youngest, was completing his medical residency, following his father's footsteps. Our annual Thanksgiving dinner had become something of a local legend. I spent weeks planning every detail, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the heritage turkey from a specialty farm. It was my showcase, proof that the girl from Ohio had successfully transformed into the matriarch of an exemplary American family. But beneath the glossy surface, cracks had been forming for years. Richard had always been controlling with finances despite my significant contribution to our wealth. I'd noticed his increasingly dismissive behavior, the eye rolls when I spoke at dinner parties, the way he'd interrupt or correct me. I'd rationalized it as the price of our success, convincing myself it was a small sacrifice for our children's advantages. Evelyn, Richard's mother, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my origins. "Remarkable how you've adapted," she'd say, making it sound like I was an exotic animal who'd learned a trick. She'd been widowed for 15 years but maintained significant influence over Richard. Though I tried countless times to win her approval through kindness and attention, nothing ever changed her opinion of me. 3 months before that fateful Thanksgiving, I'd overheard a conversation between Richard and Evelyn in his study. I'd been bringing them coffee when I heard my name. "Margaret has served her purpose," Richard said. "The children are established now. The Westlake property transfer should be simple enough," Evelyn replied. "She doesn't even know it exists." I'd quietly backed away, telling myself I must have misunderstood. Richard and I had been married for 30 years. Surely he wouldn't hide property from me, or speak about me as if I were an employee whose usefulness had ended. But as Thanksgiving approached, I couldn't ignore the signs. William no longer called me for our weekly chats. Diane had canceled our traditional pre-holiday shopping trip. Even gentle James seemed distant on the phone. Richard spent more evenings at the hospital or his club. When we did share meals, he seemed preoccupied, barely acknowledging my presence. Still, I prepared for Thanksgiving with my usual meticulousness, hoping the familiar ritual would restore our family balance. As I polished the silver that had been a gift from Richard's grandmother, I pushed away the nagging sensation that something fundamental had shifted. The morning of Thanksgiving, I noticed Richard and William having an intense conversation in the garden, their discussion stopping abruptly when I approached. Diane arrived with a portfolio of documents she quickly tucked away when I entered the room. By afternoon, the weight of unspoken tensions made it difficult to breathe beneath my carefully selected cashmere sweater. Then came William's toast, the words that confirmed my worst fears. I had become unnecessary in my own family's narrative. William had been my miracle baby. After 3 miscarriages, his birth felt like a promise fulfilled. I can still remember his tiny hand wrapped around my finger in the hospital, his serious eyes seeming to take in everything. As he grew, we developed a special bond. Richard worked endless hours during his surgical fellowship, leaving William and me to create our own world. We had our rituals, Saturday morning pancakes shaped like animals, bedtime stories where we created elaborate continuing adventures. When William showed an interest in buildings, I'd drive him to construction sites, explaining how structures rose from nothing, just as people could build themselves from humble beginnings. "You can be anything, William," I'd tell him. "Just work hard and believe in yourself." He'd been an attentive, loving son throughout childhood and his teenage years. Even when he left for Princeton, Richard's alma mater, he'd call twice weekly, asking my advice about courses and roommates. I'd felt immeasurably proud watching him graduate. Certain I'd raised a son who valued kindness alongside ambition. The change began subtly during his second year at business school. His calls became less frequent, conversations shorter. When he spoke about his future, he referenced his father's connections more than any wisdom I'd shared. I told myself it was natural, a son identifying with his father as he entered adulthood. After William joined Blackstone Financial, he'd occasionally mention managing some investments for the family. I assumed he meant the modest portfolio Richard had started for the children's education. With my focus on real estate rather than securities, I was happy to have him apply his expertise. The discovery came accidentally, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Looking for property tax records in Richard's home office, I found a folder marked Family Management WS. Inside were statements for accounts I'd never seen before, some in my name but requiring dual signatures I hadn't provided. Further investigation revealed William had been managing not just Richard's investments but mine as well, without my knowledge or consent. Several of my properties had been transferred to a family trust where I was listed as a beneficiary but not a trustee. Most disturbing was a series of systematic withdrawals from my personal business accounts, small enough to not attract immediate attention but totaling over $600,000 across 3 years. When I confronted William in his downtown apartment, showing him the documentation I'd discovered, I expected shock, perhaps embarrassment, some acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior. Instead, he regarded me with cool detachment. "Dad said you wouldn't understand the complexities," he said, pouring himself a scotch without offering me anything. "These are protective measures." "Protecting what? From whom?" My voice shook. "William, this is my money, earned from my business. A business built on Dad's connections and family name," he countered. "Let's be realistic, Mom. You wouldn't have had entree to those clients without the Sullivan name." The casual cruelty stunned me. "I built that business before you were born. I paid for our first house." "That little place in Fairfield?" He laughed. "Dad was doing you a favor letting you think you were contributing. He could have bought 10 of those with his family money." Each word felt like a physical blow. This wasn't my son, the boy who'd once made me Mother's Day cards proclaiming me his hero. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why would you take money from your own mother?" William's expression changed then, a flash of something almost like pity crossing his features. "You were never really one of us. Mom, Dad tried to elevate you, but some people just don't belong in certain circles. The money is being properly managed for the family's benefit." "I am the family," I insisted. "Parts of the family matter more than others," he replied, the rehearsed nature of his words suggesting they weren't entirely his own. "Dad always knew you'd become a liability eventually. He's just managing the situation." When I threatened to speak to our family attorney, William's expression hardened. "That would be unwise. We have documentation of concerning behavior on your part. Memory lapses, emotional instability. Dad's concerned about early onset dementia. As a doctor, his observations carry significant weight." I left William's apartment in a daze, my world collapsing around me. The son I'd raised had not only stolen from me, but threatened me. Worse, he'd revealed himself as a stranger, someone who viewed me as an interloper in my own family, a disposable element that had served its purpose and could now be discarded. Back in my car, I wept for the first time in years, feeling utterly alone. Everything I thought I'd built, my family, my legacy, my security, suddenly seemed like an elaborate illusion. For a moment, I considered driving away, disappearing to start over somewhere new. But something stopped me, perhaps, the stubborn resilience that had carried me from my humble beginnings. William had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman who had once fought her way into his world. He'd forgotten what I was capable of when cornered. After discovering William's betrayal, I desperately needed an ally. Diane had always been my practical child, the mediator in family disputes. Though she'd inherited her father's ambition, she also possessed an acute sense of fairness that I hoped would override any family conspiracy. I invited her to lunch at her favorite bistro in Boston, making the 2-hour drive with a heart full of cautious hope. Diane arrived looking polished in her designer suit, but I immediately noticed her guarded expression. Throughout our meal, she deflected personal questions, steering conversation towards safe topics like her firm's latest case and Richard's recent medical conference. When I finally broached the subject of William's financial manipulations, her reaction told me everything. There was no surprise, no outrage, only a carefully neutral expression I recognized from her courtroom appearances. "Mom, I think you're misinterpreting things," she said, folding her napkin with precision. "William is just helping organize the family assets more efficiently. Diane, he's taken money from my personal accounts, money I earned." She sighed, glancing at her watch. "This is exactly what Dad warned about. You've never really understood finance. The money isn't gone, it's been allocated more strategically." Without my knowledge or consent, I pressed. "There are concerns about your judgment lately," she said, her voice softening in a way that made my skin crawl. "Memory issues, emotional volatility. Dad's noticed symptoms for months." The coordinated narrative chilled me. I pushed further. "And you're helping William with legal documents for this? Reallocation?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face before she recovered. "I've provided some standard guidance. It's all above board, Mom." "Does that include the family trust I was never told about?" Diane's silence confirmed another betrayal. My daughter, who'd once proudly told her third-grade class that her mom was her hero for building a business while raising 3 children, had joined the coalition against me. The family dinner the following weekend revealed the extent of the conspiracy. Richard insisted on hosting at our country club rather than home, claiming the kitchen renovation, which I'd known nothing about, made entertaining impossible. As we sat surrounded by acquaintances who could prevent any meaningful conversation, I observed my family with new eyes. The subtle glances between Richard and William when certain topics arose. Diane's careful monitoring of my wine consumption. Even James, my gentle youngest, seemed uncomfortable making eye contact. When I mentioned planning our traditional family Christmas ski trip, an awkward silence fell before Richard announced they'd already made arrangements at a new resort without me. "You mentioned wanting more time to yourself," he said smoothly when I expressed confusion. "No, I didn't," I replied. "See what I mean?" Richard said to the children with a meaningful look. "The memory lapses are becoming more frequent." Later that week, searching for property documents in our home office, I discovered a folder marked Sullivan Family Trust. The trust structure was designed to protect family assets from external claims, including, apparently, those from the wife of 30 years who had helped build those assets. The beneficiaries were Richard, William, Diane, and James. I was mentioned only in provisions regarding my potential mental incapacity or death. More disturbing were the backdated amendments suggesting I had voluntarily relinquished control of joint properties. My signature appeared on documents I had never seen. The sophistication of the forgery indicated professional involvement, likely my own daughter's legal expertise. The discoveries kept coming. A group chat called Family Matters that excluded me. Credit card statements showing Richard had purchased an expensive bracelet for his assistant while claiming we needed to economize. Social invitations addressed only to Dr. Sullivan, with hosts expressing understanding about my absence due to my condition. When confronted, Richard's response was a masterclass in gaslighting. "Margaret, these paranoid accusations are exactly why we're concerned," he said, his doctor's voice both authoritative and condescending. Perhaps we should accelerate that neurological consultation. I realized then that I had been strategically isolated. My closest friends had subtly withdrawn after confidential conversations with Richard. My sister lived across the country, and my parents were deceased. My identity had become so entwined with being Mrs. Dr. Sullivan that I'd neglected independent relationships. There was one exception, my brother Thomas, who had always viewed Richard with skepticism. Living 2 states away and involved in his own business, we'd maintained contact mainly through holiday gatherings and occasional calls. When I reached out, trying to sound casual, his immediate concern told me I had at least one potential ally, Maggie. "Something's felt off about Richard for years," Thomas said during our call. At Christmas, I overheard him and William discussing contingency plans if you became difficult. When they noticed me, they quickly changed the subject. Thomas's confirmation of my suspicions provided the first real validation I'd had in months. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't losing my mind. My family, the husband I'd supported through medical school, the children I'd raised with devotion had formed a coalition to erase me from their narrative, to strip me of my assets and dignity. That night, I sat alone in my garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The home I'd lovingly maintained for decades no longer felt safe. The family I'd sacrificed for now viewed me as an obstacle. The crushing weight of betrayal made it difficult to breathe. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a smoldering anger that had roots in the determined young woman who had fought her way out of limited circumstances decades earlier. That woman hadn't disappeared entirely. She had just been dormant, comfortable in the illusion of security. Now, she was awakening. With my suspicions confirmed, and at least one ally in my corner, I began methodically investigating my family's financial maneuvers. I took advantage of Richard's weekend golf games and medical conferences to search our home thoroughly, photographing documents and downloading files from his poorly secured computer. What emerged was a pattern of systematic financial segregation spanning at least 5 years. Richard had been gradually separating our assets, establishing accounts and investments in his name only. Meanwhile, William had been helping him shift funds from joint ventures that had benefited from my work and capital. The most shocking discovery came when I found correspondence between Richard and his mother, Evelyn's estate attorney. Evelyn had substantial assets, including property in the Berkshires where our family had spent summers for years. I had managed that property for her, overseeing renovations and maintenance while she wintered in Florida. Despite our difficult relationship, I'd always believed we shared a grudging respect based on our mutual love for Richard and the children. The letters revealed Evelyn had revised her will 3 years earlier, establishing a generation-skipping trust that would pass her assets directly to our children, specifically excluding me from any inheritance or control. More disturbing were the notes from meetings where Richard had apparently suggested this arrangement, citing concerns about my potential interference with family legacy assets. The betrayal cut deeply. For 20 years, I'd driven the 3 hours to Evelyn's Berkshire home monthly, ensuring its upkeep while she enjoyed Florida sunshine. I'd arranged for local contractors to repair the roof, update the kitchen, and maintain the grounds, often negotiating favorable rates through my real estate connections. I'd stocked her pantry before her summer arrival and closed the house each fall, all while enduring her thinly veiled criticisms and reminders of my common background. Evelyn had died 6 months earlier. At her funeral, Richard had seemed genuinely moved by my organization of the service, telling guests how his mother had come to appreciate Margaret's practical contributions to the family. Now I understood his uncharacteristic acknowledgement he'd already ensured I would never benefit from those contributions. As I dug deeper, I discovered Richard maintained an offshore account in the Cayman Islands containing nearly $2 million. The account had been funded through systematic transfers from our joint business investments, ventures that had succeeded largely due to my real estate expertise and connections. The account documentation listed only Richard as the owner, with William as the secondary signatory. My brother Thomas provided another crucial piece of information when he called one evening, his voice low and urgent. "Maggie, I was at the club in Boston last weekend and saw Richard with James and William. They didn't see me at the next table. They were discussing something about getting rid of her and making sure she goes quietly. Richard said something about ensuring you wouldn't be a problem after Thanksgiving." The timeline suddenly made sense. They were planning some sort of confrontation at our annual Thanksgiving gathering the event I'd painstakingly orchestrated for years to showcase our family unity. The irony was bitter. Thomas immediately offered his support. "I'm coming to stay with you until we figure this out." They've gone too far. Having Thomas in my corner gave me courage, but I needed more allies and evidence. I began quietly copying key documents and securing them off-site. I recorded conversations on my phone when family members didn't realize I was present. I downloaded financial records and emails onto a secure drive Thomas had given me. The final confirmation of their plan came unexpectedly. Richard had left his briefcase in his study after being called to the hospital for an emergency. Inside was a folder containing a petition for guardianship, citing concerns about my mental competency. The document included evidence of erratic behavior, memory lapses, and financial mismanagement, all fabricated or grotesquely distorted versions of normal events. Most chilling was a psychological evaluation from a doctor I'd never met, diagnosing me with cognitive decline consistent with early-onset dementia. Richard had apparently used his professional connections to obtain a fraudulent evaluation. The following day, Richard casually mentioned some routine paperwork that needed my signature, just tax-related matters, he said, placing a stack of documents on the kitchen counter as I prepared dinner. I pretended to glance at them, noting they were the same guardianship documents I'd discovered. When I told him I'd review them later, his expression flickered with annoyance before he recovered his pleasant facade. "Best to handle it now," he insisted. "They're time-sensitive." "I never sign anything without reading it thoroughly," I replied, continuing to chop vegetables. "You taught me that, remember?" Later, alone in our bedroom, I examined the papers closely. Hidden among standard tax forms was a consent to voluntary psychiatric evaluation and temporary transfer of financial authority. Had I signed without reading, as I might have done in the past, trusting my husband of 30 years, I would have effectively surrendered control of my life. The depth of betrayal was breathtaking. The man who had vowed to cherish me, the children I had raised with unconditional love, had constructed an elaborate plot to declare me incompetent and seize control of everything we had built together. They hadn't just planned to divorce me or push me aside, they intended to erase my agency entirely, to render me powerless through false claims of mental decline. That night, I made a decision. I would not confront them immediately. I would not show my hand. Like the opponents they had revealed themselves to be, I would play a strategic game gathering evidence, securing resources, and building alliances. The Thanksgiving confrontation they planned would happen, but not on their terms. The girl from Ohio who had fought her way into their world knew how to fight, and this time she was fighting for her very existence. Richard's medical expertise became the centerpiece of their strategy. As a respected surgeon with colleagues throughout the healthcare system, his observations about my supposed cognitive decline carried tremendous weight. I began noticing how frequently he mentioned my confusion or memory issues in front of others, subtle comments that seemed concerned rather than malicious to outside observers. Margaret forgot about the Hendersons' dinner party last week, he would mention casually to friends. It's happening more frequently now. The fact that he had deliberately misinformed me about the date, telling me it was Saturday when it was actually Friday, was never mentioned. William and Diane reinforced this narrative. "Mom's been repeating herself a lot," Diane told our longtime neighbors. "Dad's been so patient with her." William would share concerned glances with his father when I spoke at family gatherings, silently communicating that my contributions shouldn't be taken seriously. Even James, my youngest and previously least involved in the conspiracy, began monitoring my health in unsettling ways. A resident in psychiatry rather than his father's surgical specialty, James would ask pointed questions about my sleep patterns and mood, taking notes on his phone. When I questioned this behavior, he claimed it was for a research project, but I later discovered he was documenting supposed symptoms of cognitive impairment. The most disturbing revelation came when I began experiencing actual episodes of confusion and disorientation. After decades of perfect health and mental clarity, I suddenly found myself forgetting conversations, feeling inexplicably drowsy in the afternoons, and struggling to concentrate. When I mentioned these symptoms to Richard, his expression of grave concern seemed overlaid with satisfaction. My suspicions grew one evening when I noticed Richard insisting on preparing my evening tea, a task he'd never shown interest in before. Claiming a headache, I set the tea aside untouched, and later examined it, finding a powdery residue at the bottom. I carefully preserved samples from several subsequent beverages and meals Richard prepared specially for me. My brother Thomas connected me with a discreet laboratory technician who identified traces of benzodiazepines and other sedating medications in the samples, drugs that could easily produce symptoms of confusion, memory problems, and lethargy. My husband, a physician sworn to first do no harm, was systematically drugging me to manufacture evidence of mental decline. Horrified, but now certain of their methods, I began taking precautions, only eating food I prepared myself, disposing of beverages Richard offered, and pretending to swallow the vitamins he'd recently insisted I needed. Almost immediately, my mental clarity returned, confirming my suspicions. I needed medical documentation of my actual condition from someone unconnected to Richard's network. Through Thomas's connections, I met Dr. Sarah Bennett, a neurologist practicing in a different hospital system than Richard's. After thorough evaluation, including cognitive testing and toxicology screening, Dr. Bennett confirmed I showed no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, but did have traces of medications I hadn't been prescribed. "What you're describing is medical gaslighting," Dr. Bennett told me, her expression grave, "and potentially criminal. Administering medication without consent is assault." Dr. Bennett became my second ally, carefully documenting her findings and arranging for additional tests through colleagues who had no connection to Richard. She helped me understand how Richard had been using my medical records, accessing information through his hospital privileges, and potentially altering data. "The medical community tends to believe other physicians," she explained, "especially someone with your husband's standing. Most doctors wouldn't question his observations about his own wife's health." The family's gaslighting intensified as Thanksgiving approached. When I correctly remembered appointment times or social engagements, Richard would exchange concerned glances with the children. "That's not quite right, dear," he would say gently, providing incorrect information with such conviction that I sometimes doubted my own memory, despite knowing I was right. William and Diane began speaking to me slowly, over-explaining simple concepts as if I couldn't understand them. James would perform impromptu cognitive assessments disguised as games or casual conversation. Their coordinated efforts to make me appear confused and incompetent were sophisticated and relentless. The situation reached a crisis point 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Richard announced he had scheduled a routine checkup for me with a colleague who specialized in geriatric psychiatry. When I questioned the necessity, he produced documents I had supposedly signed consenting to the evaluation, another forgery. When I refused to attend, his mask of concern dropped momentarily. "This can happen voluntarily or involuntarily," he said, his voice cold. "Your recent behavior gives us grounds for an emergency psychiatric hold if necessary." I recognized the threat for what it was if I resisted their narrative. They would force a psychiatric evaluation under duress, ensuring the results would support their claims of my instability. Any resistance would be interpreted as further evidence of my declining mental state. That evening, Richard received an emergency call from the hospital. As soon as he left, I contacted Dr. Bennett, who advised me to leave the house immediately. "They're accelerating their timeline," she warned. "Once you're in a psychiatric facility under your husband's influence, it will be extremely difficult to prove you don't belong there." Within 30 minutes, Thomas arrived to drive me to a secure location, a small apartment he had quietly rented in my name the previous week. As we drove away from the home I had lovingly maintained for decades, I felt both terrified and oddly liberated. "They've underestimated you, Maggie," Thomas said as we drove through the night. "They think you're just going to roll over and let them erase you." "They forgot where I came from," I replied, watching my neighborhood disappear in the side mirror, "and what I had to do to get here." For the next week, I maintained the appearance of normalcy through carefully worded text messages to Richard, claiming I was staying with a real estate client to help with an emergency property situation. Meanwhile, I worked with Dr. Bennett to document the evidence of medical manipulation and began implementing the counter-strategy I had been developing. The family that thought they could drug me into submission, that believed they could convince the world I was losing my mind, had made a critical error. They had pushed me to a point where I had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. While discovering the medical manipulation was horrifying, the systematic theft of my assets was equally devastating. The home we lived in, a colonial revival I had found, negotiated, and largely paid for through my real estate commissions, had been transferred to the family trust that excluded me as a trustee. The paperwork showed my signature, obviously forged, authorizing the transfer. The property held particular significance because its down payment had come from my inheritance money from my grandmother, who had worked as a housekeeper her entire life, saving every penny to leave something to her only grandchild. She had died just as I was starting my real estate career, and her modest legacy had enabled us to purchase our first home. Through strategic sales and purchases over the years, that initial investment had grown into our current residence. Richard had always diminished my grandmother's contribution. Barely enough for a decent car, he'd commented when the check arrived. But those insignificant funds had been the foundation of our property portfolio, a fact he conveniently omitted from the family narrative. From my secure apartment, I began a comprehensive audit of our assets. What I discovered was a methodical dismantling of my financial existence. The vacation property in Vermont that I'd found, negotiated, and renovated myself had been transferred to William's name. My office building, purchased with proceeds from my first major commercial deal, had been refinanced with the equity redirected to accounts I couldn't access. Even personal items had been systematically cataloged and removed. Through the home security system I could still access remotely, I watched Diane methodically photographing and documenting my jewelry, artwork, and antiques one afternoon when they believed I was at a client meeting. My grandmother's modest diamond ring, the only thing of value she had owned, was conspicuously missing from my jewelry box. Later, I discovered Diane had created an inventory categorizing my possessions as family heirlooms, to be retained, or Margaret's personal items, to be stored or disposed of. The business I had built from nothing had not escaped their attention either. Sullivan Properties had grown from my kitchen table enterprise to a respected firm with multiple agents and commercial holdings. I had started with nothing but determination, cold calling potential clients while Richard was completing his residency. Many nights I'd worked on listings after putting the children to bed, building a client base through sheer persistence. The discovery that my business partner, Helen, had been approached by Richard came through an inadvertent comment from her assistant. Dr. Sullivan mentioned the transition might happen after Thanksgiving, the young woman said when I called about an unrelated matter. When pressed, she revealed Richard had discussed changes in ownership structure due to health concerns. Helen, to her credit, had been uncomfortable with these discussions. When I contacted her directly from my secure location, she immediately agreed to meet at a coffee shop far from our usual haunts. Richard said you were having cognitive issues and wanted to step back, she admitted, looking troubled. He mentioned a family decision to streamline assets. It didn't sound like you, but he had William with him, and they had documentation. Her voice trailed off as she saw my expression. None of that is true, I told her, and I need you as a witness that I am perfectly cognitively sound. Helen became another crucial ally, agreeing to block any changes to the business ownership while I gathered evidence. Her husband, an attorney specializing in elder law, offered valuable insights into how to protect myself from further financial exploitation. My next shock came when I attempted to access our joint accounts and discovered my access had been frozen due to suspicious activity. When I called the bank, I was informed that Richard had reported concerns about unauthorized transactions and requested a security hold. The customer service representative suggested I have a family member assist me with accessing the account, the very people who were systematically stealing from me. Fortunately, I had maintained separate personal accounts. Richard knew nothing about a practice I'd started early in our marriage when his controlling approach to finances had made me uncomfortable. These accounts contained enough to sustain me temporarily, but they represented only a fraction of what was rightfully mine after decades of hard work. My longtime family attorney, Jeffrey Peterson, had handled our wills, property transfers, and business matters for 20 years. When I called for an emergency appointment, his assistant seemed oddly evasive. After persistent requests, I secured a meeting, only to have Jeffrey inform me he could no longer represent me due to a conflict of interest. Richard and William consulted with me last month about some family trust matters, he explained, not meeting my eyes. As I've represented both you and Richard for many years, I cannot take sides in a potential dispute. The systematic isolation was nearly complete. My family had methodically cut off my professional relationships, financial resources, and even my personal possessions. They had anticipated and blocked the most obvious avenues for fighting back. What they hadn't counted on was Catherine Maxwell, a formidable attorney I met through Dr. Bennett's sister. Catherine specialized in cases of financial elder abuse and had successfully fought similar family conspiracies. Unlike Jeffrey, she had no prior relationship with Richard and no professional network overlapping with his. Most importantly, she recognized the pattern immediately. "This is orchestrated financial abuse," Catherine said after reviewing my documentation during our first meeting. "The medical manipulation adds a disturbing dimension, but the pattern is one I've seen before. Successful woman builds assets, controlling husband and adult children, decides she's expendable and construct an elaborate pretext to seize control." Catherine took my case on contingency, recognizing that my immediate access to funds was limited. "They expect you to give up," she said. "People like your husband count on shame and family loyalty to silence victims. They don't expect to be fought publicly." Catherine helped me secure emergency orders freezing further asset transfers and filed preliminary documentation contesting the validity of signatures on key financial documents. She also connected me with a forensic accountant who began tracking the movement of funds from our joint assets to Richard's separate accounts. As Thanksgiving approached, I had established a foundation for reclaiming my financial existence. The home and assets that represented decades of my work remained largely in their control, but I had begun the process of challenging their theft. More importantly, I had documented evidence of forgery, fraud, and financial exploitation that would be difficult to explain away. On the evening before I was due to return home for the Thanksgiving gathering, Catherine reviewed our strategy once more. "Remember, record everything. Your phone will be continuously backing up to secure cloud storage. Say nothing about what you know until they make their move. Let them incriminate themselves." As I prepared to return to the house that was legally no longer mine, I thought about my grandmother, whose modest legacy had been the foundation of our family wealth. She had often told me, "Nobody can take what's inside you, Margaret. Education, determination, dignity, those are yours forever." They had taken my home, my business, and my family. But they had not taken the core of steel that had carried me from a small Ohio town to the life I had built. That steel was now tempered by betrayal, forged into something sharper and more dangerous than they could imagine. While the financial and medical aspects of the conspiracy were devastating, the systematic destruction of my social standing proved equally painful. For 30 years, I had carefully cultivated relationships throughout our community, serving on charity boards, volunteering at the hospital auxiliary, hosting fundraisers for local causes. These connections represented not just social capital but my identity beyond being Richard's wife or the children's mother. The first indication of social sabotage came when Barbara Phillips, my supposed best friend of 20 years, began declining our regular lunch dates. We had met when our children were in preschool together and had supported each other through life's milestones, marriages, births, deaths, and celebrations. Barbara had been my confidant, the person I trusted with doubts I could never express to Richard. When I finally cornered her after a chance meeting at the grocery store, her discomfort was palpable. "Richard mentioned you've been having difficulties," she said, not meeting my eyes. "He thought it might be better if you focused on your health for a while without social pressures." "What difficulties exactly?" I pressed. Barbara's response revealed the extent of Richard's campaign. He mentioned outbursts, confusion, some paranoid ideas about the family finances. "Margaret, he's worried about early-onset dementia. He showed me some concerning incidents on your home security videos. The manipulation was breathtaking. Richard had apparently edited security footage to create a false narrative about my behavior, then shared it selectively with my closest friends under the guise of concern. No wonder Barbara looked at me with that mixture of pity and discomfort. She believed I was losing my mind and didn't know it. Similar patterns emerged across my social circles. The president of the hospital auxiliary, a group where I'd volunteered countless hours, called to suggest I take a sabbatical from my committee responsibilities. My invitation to chair the annual charity gala, an honor I had earned after years of dedicated fundraising, was rescinded due to restructuring of leadership roles. The country club where we had been members for decades became another battleground. When I arrived for my regular tennis match, my standing reservation had been canceled. The membership director awkwardly explained that there had been concerns about my behavior at recent events, though he couldn't specify what those concerns were. Later, I discovered Richard had reported incidents of me becoming disoriented and behaving erratically at club functions, events that had never occurred. The most public humiliation came at the Westchester Community Foundation's annual benefit, an event I had helped organize for 15 years. I arrived alone, Richard having claimed a last-minute surgical emergency. As I entered the ballroom, conversations quieted noticeably. The seating arrangement had been changed. My usual place at the main benefactor's table was occupied by Richard's hospital colleague. I was relegated to a table in the back, seated with people I barely knew. Midway through the evening, the foundation director, Eleanor Harrington, approached me with a strained smile. "Margaret, I think it might be best if you leave early," she whispered. "We've had some concerns expressed about your condition. Richard warned us there might be an episode." "What episode?" I asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "What exactly did my husband tell you to expect?" Eleanor's expression confirmed everything. He mentioned unpredictable behavior, confusion about appropriate social boundaries. "Please don't make a scene. For everyone's sake." The orchestrated exclusion extended even to my church community. For 3 decades, I had taught Sunday school, organized meal deliveries for ill parishioners, and served on the vestry. The rector, who had counseled Richard and me through difficult periods in our marriage, now avoided eye contact during services. When I approached him after worship, his discomfort was obvious. "Richard has shared some concerns," he admitted reluctantly. "He's worried about your spiritual well-being given your challenges. He thought it might be better if you stepped back from church responsibilities while you focus on treatment." "Treatment for what, exactly?" I demanded. "He mentioned alcoholism alongside the cognitive issues," the rector said quietly. "The hidden bottles, the mood swings. Margaret, there's no shame in seeking help." The fabricated alcoholism accusation explained why several friends had stopped inviting me to social gatherings where wine would be served. It provided a convenient explanation for any erratic behavior Richard might have invented and made me appear less credible if I challenged his narrative. The discovery of Richard's affair with my former friend Cynthia Walker came through an accidental glimpse of his phone notifications. A message preview appeared. "Missing you. Last night was incredible. Delete this. See." Further investigation revealed a relationship spanning at least 2 years conducted partly at charity events I had organized. The ultimate social humiliation came at the Westchester Arts Council Gala. Despite the campaign against me, I had maintained my annual sponsorship and arrived determined to present a dignified face. Richard had claimed another emergency surgery, but insisted I attend to maintain appearances. Halfway through the evening, the event chair clinked her glass for attention and announced a special recognition. "We are deeply grateful to Dr. Richard Sullivan for his extraordinary contribution to our new children's arts therapy wing," she announced. "While he couldn't be here tonight due to saving lives in surgery, his generous donation of $1 million will transform our community programming." The room erupted in applause while I sat frozen. The donation made without my knowledge from our joint assets was presented solely in Richard's name, erasing my decades of involvement with the organization. As attendees offered congratulations on my husband's generosity, I maintained a wooden smile, aware that any visible distress would simply reinforce the narrative of my instability. Later that evening, I received a text from Richard. "Hope you represented the family well tonight. Remember to be home by 11. You need your rest before your doctor's appointment tomorrow." There was no surgery. Leaving the gala early, I drove past the hospital and saw Richard's car parked outside Cynthia's downtown apartment building. That night marked my darkest moment. Alone in our empty house, surrounded by photographs of the family that had conspired against me, I contemplated ending the pain permanently. For several hours, I sat in Richard's study with his antique service revolver, a family heirloom from his grandfather, contemplating a final escape from the calculated destruction of everything I had built. What saved me was an unexpected text from Marta Jimenez, a former client whose first home I had helped her purchase 15 years earlier against Richard's advice. "Why waste time on a minimum down payment?" he had complained. Marta had become a successful restaurant owner and community leader. "Margaret, I've been hearing strange rumors," her message read. "None of it sounds like you. Are you okay? Really okay?" No judgment, just concern. That single, genuine expression of concern from someone peripheral to my inner circle broke through my despair. I put away the revolver and called Marta, sharing a carefully edited version of my situation. Her immediate, unquestioning support reminded me that not everyone in my life had been poisoned against me. "This is not who you are," Marta insisted. "The woman who fought for me when no one else would take me seriously is not someone who gives up. Let me help." Marta became another crucial ally, offering both emotional support and practical assistance. Through her extensive community connections, she helped me identify others who had noticed the campaign against me but hadn't known how to reach out. Slowly, I began building a shadow network of support beyond Richard's influence. The isolation had been nearly complete, the social destruction methodically executed. But Richard and the children had overlooked the relationships I had formed independently through my business and community work connections based on genuine respect rather than social obligation. These relationships now formed the foundation of my counter-strategy. As Thanksgiving approached, I understood that the family's plan relied heavily on my social isolation. They expected me to arrive broken, desperate for reconciliation, willing to accept any terms to avoid public humiliation. Instead, I would arrive with a hidden network of supporters and documented evidence of their systematic campaign to destroy me. The woman they had tried to erase was preparing to reappear not as a victim, but as an adversary they had grievously underestimated. After that night with the revolver, something fundamental shifted within me. The despair that had threatened to consume me transformed into cold, focused resolve. I would not disappear quietly. I would not surrender the life I had built. Most importantly, I would not allow my children to become the kind of people who would destroy their own mother for financial gain. My first step was acknowledging that self-pity was useless. The situation required strategic thinking, not emotional reactions. I needed to approach my family as adversaries rather than loved ones, a painful realization, but necessary for survival. Catherine Maxwell, my attorney, became the architect of my legal strategy. In her downtown office, surrounded by case files and legal references, we documented everything from the medical manipulation to the financial fraud to the social sabotage. "Evidence is everything," Catherine emphasized. "Your word against Richards would be challenging given his professional standing and the groundwork he's laid. But documented evidence is much harder to dismiss." We established a secure communication system using encrypted messaging and private email servers beyond Richard's technical knowledge. Catherine taught me to record conversations legally in Connecticut, a one-party consent state, and how to properly document financial discrepancies. "They expect you to behave emotionally," she noted. "That's been their narrative. The unstable, confused wife. Your power lies in calculated, documented responses." Technology became my unexpected ally. Though Richard considered himself sophisticated, his digital security was surprisingly lax, perhaps reflecting his generational overconfidence. With guidance from a cybersecurity specialist Catherine recommended, I gained access to family email exchanges, financial records, and even the digital surveillance system Richard had installed in our home. The recordings were illuminating. In my absence, the family spoke openly about their plans. William discussing the Margaret situation with clinical detachment, Diane reviewing legal strategies for the guardianship petition, even James practicing how to testify about my supposed symptoms should a court hearing become necessary. Most chilling was Richard instructing them on their roles for Thanksgiving. "She'll be emotional, possibly confrontational. Remember, anything aggressive or irrational reinforces our position. William, you'll lead with the toast we discussed. Diane, you have the papers ready. James, your medical observations carry weight. Emphasize the cognitive disconnects you've documented." Armed with this knowledge, I prepared countermeasures for every scenario they had planned. Simultaneously, I reached out to Richard's former business partner, Dr. Lawrence Chen, who had mysteriously dissolved their practice partnership 5 years earlier. Through mutual connections, I arranged a discreet meeting at his lake house, 2 hours from the city. "I've been waiting for this conversation," Lawrence said after hearing a portion of my story. Richard didn't just push me out, he orchestrated a systematic campaign questioning my competence after I raised concerns about billing practices. Lawrence described a pattern identical to my experience. Richard had manipulated colleagues, planted rumors about drinking problems, and eventually manufactured documentation of medical errors that never occurred. The partnership dissolution had cost Lawrence millions and nearly destroyed his reputation. I rebuilt elsewhere, but I kept everything, Lawrence explained, retrieving a secured file from his home safe. Documentation of falsified Medicare billing. Patient records altered to justify unnecessary procedures. Referral kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. I was waiting for the right moment. This evidence of Richard's professional misconduct provided powerful leverage and connected me with others who had experienced similar treatment. Through Lawrence's introductions, I built relationships with former nurses, administrators, and colleagues who had observed Richard's ethical violations but feared his influence in the medical community. My real estate expertise proved valuable in identifying irregularities in the family's property transactions. Working with a forensic accountant, I documented how properties had been systematically undervalued in transfers to the family trust, constituting potential tax fraud. I discovered Richard had created shell companies for property holdings that generated substantial unreported income, a clear IRS violation. Williams' investment firm presented another vulnerability. Through industry contacts I'd maintained independently, I learned his rapid advancement had come through questionable trading practices and regulatory shortcuts. Several transactions involving family assets violated financial industry regulations regarding conflict of interest. While gathering evidence, I executed a business maneuver Richard and William knew nothing about. Years earlier, I had identified a commercial property with exceptional potential but complex zoning challenges. The owners, an elderly couple retiring to Arizona, had given me first right of refusal on the property out of gratitude for helping their daughter find her first home. Using my separate funds and working through a shell company Catherine helped establish, I finalized the purchase and zoning variances. The property's value instantly quadrupled, creating a financial foundation Richard couldn't touch and establishing my business independence regardless of the outcome with family assets. As Thanksgiving approached, I prepared methodically for every scenario. Catherine and I developed response scripts for each likely confrontation. We prepared documentation packages for key authorities should immediate legal intervention become necessary. A private security professional swept my clothing and belongings for tracking devices and ensured my new phone was secure from spyware. Most importantly, I rehearsed maintaining emotional control regardless of provocation. In Catherine's office, we conducted mock confrontations with her associates, playing my family members, hurling accusations and gaslighting attempts while I practiced calm, factual responses. "Your strength is in refusing to play their game," Catherine emphasized after a particularly brutal simulation. "They expect emotional outbursts that confirm their narrative. Your controlled response disrupts their entire strategy." 2 days before Thanksgiving, I finalized preparations with my support network. Thomas would be positioned nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Dr. Bennett had provided comprehensive medical documentation confirming my cognitive health and evidence of drugging. Catherine had legal paperwork prepared for immediate filing, depending on how events unfolded. The night before Thanksgiving, I meditated in my temporary apartment, centering myself for the confrontation ahead. On my phone, I reviewed photos of my children from happier times: William's college graduation, Diane's first court appearance, James receiving his white coat. I allowed myself to grieve the relationships that had been irrevocably damaged while acknowledging the necessity of holding them accountable. They made their choices. I told Thomas during our final planning call. Tomorrow, I reclaim mine. As dawn broke on Thanksgiving morning, I dressed carefully in a tailored blue suit that projected confidence and authority, not the festive, maternal outfit Richard would expect. I applied makeup that highlighted my clarity and strength rather than attempting to look younger or softer. I wore my grandmother's modest diamond ring recovered from Diane's jewelry box during a reconnaissance visit as my only adornment. Driving toward the home that legally no longer belonged to me, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. The frightened, betrayed woman of recent months had transformed into someone stronger, someone who had faced the worst betrayal imaginable and found the courage to fight back. They had planned to erase Margaret Sullivan, to reduce her to a confused footnote in the family history. Instead, they would meet a formidable opponent, prepared to reclaim not just her assets, but her very identity. The Connecticut estate came into view, decorated impeccably for the holiday as always. Smoke curled from the chimney. Cars lined the circular driveway. The children had arrived early as planned in their strategy session. Through the large front windows, I could see them gathered in the living room, rehearsing their roles in the intervention they had planned. They were expecting a mother defeated by isolation and gaslighting, desperate to preserve family relationships at any cost. They would instead face the woman I had rediscovered through their betrayal, the determined fighter who had built everything they were attempting to steal. I parked the car, checked that my recording devices were active, and walked toward the front door with steady steps. The time for fear and hurt had passed. Now was the time for justice and accountability. I paused at the massive oak door of the home I had lovingly maintained for decades. Through the beveled glass panels, I could see them assembled in the foyer, Richard adjusting William's tie, Diane reviewing documents in a leather portfolio, James arranging glasses on a silver tray. The tableau of family unity would have seemed heartwarming to anyone unaware of the treachery it concealed. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the doorbell rather than using my key, a small but significant acknowledgement that this was no longer truly my home. Richard opened the door with his camera-ready smile, the one he used for hospital board meetings and charity galas. "Margaret, darling, we were getting concerned," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of worry for anyone who might be listening. "The turkey's nearly ready." The house smelled of sage and butter, the traditional Thanksgiving aromas I had created year after year. This time, the meal had been prepared without me, another sign of my intended erasure from family traditions. The children greeted me with careful hugs and watchful eyes. William's was perfunctory, a bare social requirement. Diane's lingered slightly longer, perhaps harboring some remnant of genuine feeling beneath her complicity. James could barely meet my gaze, his discomfort the most pronounced, the youngest, the last to fully join their coalition. "You look different," Richard observed, his eyes narrowing slightly at my professional attire. "We thought you might wear the burgundy dress from last year." "I felt this was more appropriate for today's discussion," I replied evenly. A flicker of unease crossed his face, the first indication that I might not be following their expected script. He recovered quickly, guiding me toward the dining room where the table had been set with my grandmother's china and the sterling silver flatware I had collected piece by piece over decades. "Everything looks lovely," I commented, noting how they had recreated my traditional arrangements without my input. "Who did the flower centerpiece?" "I did," Diane said with a hint of pride. "I remembered how you always balanced the heights and textures." "You learned well," I acknowledged, wondering if she recognized the metaphor for how thoroughly they had studied me before attempting to replace me. The meal proceeded with artificial normalcy, serving dishes passed, compliments on the cooking exchanged, safe topics discussed. Richard maintained his role as benevolent patriarch, refilling wine glasses and guiding conversation away from anything substantive. The children followed his lead, creating a performance of family harmony that might have convinced me of my paranoia had I not possessed irrefutable evidence of their conspiracy. When the dessert plates had been cleared and coffee served, William stood with practiced casualness, raising his crystal champagne flute. The moment from my nightmares had arrived, the toast that would signal the beginning of my intended removal from the family narrative. "Thanksgiving is about appreciation," William began, his investment banker's confidence on full display. "About recognizing what truly matters in life." His eyes moved around the table before settling coldly on mine. "Some people matter. Others just take up space," he continued, the rehearsed cruelty landing precisely as intended. "This family has carried dead weight for too long. Today, we remedy that situation." I felt the weight of their collective gaze, expecting tears, confusion, perhaps incoherent protests that would further their narrative of my instability. Instead, I smiled calmly and raised my water glass. "Thank you, William, for making explicit what has been implicit for some time," I replied, my voice steady. I couldn't have created a clearer opening for this conversation if I'd scripted it myself. Confusion flickered across their faces. This wasn't the reaction they had anticipated. Richard moved to regain control. "Margaret, we've been concerned about you for some time," he began, sliding effortlessly into his doctor's voice. "The memory issues, the emotional volatility, the financial confusion, the medications you've been adding to my food and beverages," I interrupted. "Yes, those would certainly cause such symptoms." The momentary freeze around the table was deeply satisfying. That's exactly the kind of paranoid accusation we're concerned about, Diane interjected, right on cue. Mom, we have documentation of cognitive decline going back nearly 2 years. Falsified documentation, I corrected. Just like the forged signatures on property transfers, the manufactured evidence of financial mismanagement, and the coordinated campaign to isolate me socially. Richard's mask of concern hardened slightly. Margaret, this is difficult for all of us. We're trying to help you. By drugging me? By stealing my assets? By destroying my reputation and relationships? I removed a small recorder from my jacket pocket and placed it on the table. Shall we review your strategy session from last week? You were quite explicit about the roles each of you would play today. The color drained from Richard's face. William's jaw tightened in anger. Diane's legal training kicked in as she attempted damage control. Recording private conversations without consent is illegal, she stated with forced authority. Not in Connecticut with one-party consent, I replied. But thank you for the legal advice, Diane. I'll add it to the guidance I've received from Catherine Maxwell, of Maxwell, Bernstein, and Torres, my attorney who specializes in elder abuse and financial fraud cases. The mention of Catherine's prominent firm caused visible discomfort. Richard attempted to pivot. Whatever you think you know has been distorted by your condition, he insisted. The medication you mentioned is a legitimate treatment prescribed for your benefit, prescribed without my knowledge or consent, in food and beverages, creating symptoms you then documented as evidence of cognitive decline, I summarized. Dr. Sarah Bennett, a neurologist with no connection to your hospital system, has comprehensive documentation of both my actual cognitive health and the presence of unprescribed benzodiazepines and other sedatives in my system. I turned to James, who had remained silent, his medical ethics clearly at war with family loyalty. Tell me, James, what does the medical board typically do with physicians who administer medication without patient consent, or who falsify medical records to support fraudulent guardianship petitions? James paled, looking to his father for guidance. Richard's expression had transformed from concerned physician to calculating adversary. What do you want? He asked flatly. Abandoning the pretense. Accountability, I replied. I have documented everything. The financial fraud, the medical manipulation, the coordinated social isolation, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the tax evasion, the Medicare billing irregularities from your practice. I placed a USB drive on the table beside the recorder. This contains evidence sufficient for criminal charges, civil litigation, professional disciplinary action, and significant IRS penalties. A duplicate has already been secured with my attorney, with instructions for distribution to relevant authorities should anything happen to me. The stunned silence confirmed they had never anticipated this level of counterattack. They had expected a confused, isolated woman desperate to maintain family connections, not a strategic opponent with documented evidence and professional allies. You would destroy this family? Richard finally asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. You plan to destroy me, I corrected. To erase me from my own life after I devoted 30 years to building this family. To declare me incompetent, seize my assets, and relegate me to some facility where I could be conveniently forgotten. I looked at each of my children in turn. You were willing to commit fraud, perjury, and elder abuse against your own mother. For what? An inheritance you would eventually have received anyway? Control of assets I helped build? The approval of a father who taught you that loyalty and integrity are disposable when inconvenient? The weight of their actions seemed to register differently with each child. William remained defiant, his expression calculating. Diane's legal mind was clearly assessing exposure and liability. James looked genuinely shaken, perhaps fully realizing for the first time the moral boundary they had crossed. Here are my terms, I continued, sliding a document across the table. Full restoration of all assets transferred without my legitimate consent. Dissolution of the fraudulent family trust. Public acknowledgement of my contributions to family properties and businesses, and your voluntary participation in family counseling to address the ethical and moral failures that led to this conspiracy. Richard scanned the document, his surgeon's composure cracking slightly. And if we refuse? Then tomorrow morning, Catherine files the comprehensive evidence package with the district attorney's office, the medical licensing board, the IRS, the financial regulatory authorities, and the ethics committee of every professional organization to which you belong. I stated simply, your choice. The facade of family unity shattered completely. William began arguing for fighting the allegations, calculating the cost of legal defense against potential penalties. Diane retreated into technical legal analysis, assessing admissibility of evidence and potential counterarguments. James sat silently, the weight of his participation visibly crushing him. Richard watched them with growing recognition that his carefully orchestrated plan had imploded spectacularly. The wife he had dismissed as expendable, the woman he had systematically attempted to erase, had outmaneuvered him completely. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, I said, standing to leave. Thanksgiving seems an appropriate deadline for determining whether this family has anything left worth saving. As I walked toward the door, James suddenly rose and followed me. Mom, he said quietly in the foyer, his voice breaking slightly. I'm sorry. I didn't understand what was really happening until it was too late. I looked at my youngest child, the gentlest of the three, the one who had always seemed most like me in temperament. There's always a moment when we decide who we are, James, I told him. You still have that choice ahead of you. 1 year later, I hosted a very different Thanksgiving in my new home, a light-filled contemporary overlooking the Long Island Sound. The guest list reflected my rebuilt life. Thomas and his family, Dr. Bennett, Catherine, and her partner, Marta, and her children, and other genuine friends who had stood by me during the darkest days. The legal aftermath had been less explosive than might have been expected. Richard, ever calculating, had accepted most of my terms rather than risk criminal charges and professional ruin. The financial settlements had restored my assets and provided substantial independence. His reputation had suffered from the carefully managed exposure of certain elements of his behavior, but he had avoided the complete professional destruction my evidence could have caused. William remained estranged, unable to acknowledge his betrayal or accept my forgiveness. Diane maintained formal, lawyer-mediated contact, her ambition now tempered by the recognition of lines that should not be crossed. Only James had genuinely sought reconciliation, undertaking therapy and gradually rebuilding our relationship through honest conversation and accountability. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation, established with a portion of my recovered assets, now provided education and legal support for victims of family financial abuse, particularly older women targeted by spouses and adult children. The work gave purpose to my experience and helped others recognize warning signs I had missed. As we gathered around my new table, I offered a different kind of toast than the one that had started this journey. To finding worth beyond others' definitions, I said, raising my glass. To recognizing that we all matter. Not because of what we provide to others, but because of who we choose to be in our most challenging moments. The warm response from those gathered people who valued me for myself rather than for what I could provide or represent confirmed what I had finally learned through the crucible of betrayal. Our worth is never determined by those who cannot see our value. It is established by our own courage, integrity, and resilience when faced with those who would diminish us. My son had been right about one thing. Some people do matter in our lives. Others indeed take up space. The wisdom lies in recognizing the difference and in becoming someone who matters in your own story. What would you do if someone in your family betrayed you like this? Have you ever had to stand up to people who tried to make you feel worthless? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that they matter, regardless of what others might say. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, your worth is never determined by those who fail to see your value.